London School of Economics and Political Science is here in Kuala Lumpur at the LSE Asia Forum 2014. And thanks to that, I have had the opportunity to interview distinguished professors, and one right now sitting across from me is Professor Ricky Badat, Professor of Urban Studies at LSE. And I missed your presentation, but I've been gathering thoughts from others who have been there. And I guess one of the most pertaining question in Kuala Lumpur right now, because even as we are sitting here, the air outside is hazy, because if we just look at the city, but smoke and haze can come from other geographical locations, not even inside the country, but even from across the Straits of Malacca to here. So I guess the pertinent question would be, as a start, how do you grow a sustainable city at a time when environmental pressures and issues are escalating in terms of climate change, in terms of growing population, for example? So when you look at cities like KL, what comes to your mind?
Well, let's stand back a moment, because, of course, the growth that KL is experiencing now, nearly 3% a year, which is a lot, is very typical of cities around some regions of the world. Okay. And different cities have different problems, and we can talk about them. The fact that the size and shape and the speed of change of a city has an impact on the environment is absolutely the case. Let's say, to simplify very quickly the story, the more a city is widespread, sprawling, goes on and on forever, right? The more it requires people to commute and usually use private cars, and the more that has a negative impact on the quality of air, pollution, and the environment, broadly speaking. And the more condensed they are, the more compact they are, and of course the more they are better serviced by some form of public transport, either below ground or underground, the less there is need to commute long distances, and therefore potentially the more efficient the city is, and therefore the less negative its impact on the environment. But these are issues, as you have said to me, which are not just unique to KL or just this part of the world. And they're very different models in which you can deal with growth in a sustainable way. And that really does depend on a number of things. One is, where are you in the economic cycle? Okay. No? Second is, what is the political system? And thirdly is, what is the culture, the DNA within which these cities are growing? So if you want, I can talk about those sort of three issues. Let's start with the last point. There is no doubt that coming from, as I did yesterday, 2 days ago, from London, which is a very green city insofar as nearly every building, every house is 2-3 floors with a front and back garden. It's a dispersed city of nearly 9 million people now, but it has an extraordinary and very old, 150-year-old underground system, rail system, bus system, public transport. That city has a culture about it that people like living that way, but they've also invested. We as taxpayers actually have to contribute quite a lot of our tax base, but also paying for the transport. But that's the way we like it. In a way, it is therefore a way of managing growth. It's not as fast growing as obviously KL or other Asian cities, but that is one aspect to, I think, consider. Therefore, how people like to live. Right? Now, if you take as another extreme, perhaps Hong Kong, where you have a much greater density and people living there for smaller apartments, they are more ready, and that's their culture, to make decisions about, do I want to live 15 minutes away from where I work or 1 hour away? And so that's it. Where you are in the economic cycle, I think, is also incredibly important because of basically availability of funding for investment for infrastructure. Now, if we think of the fast-growing, affluent Asian countries, of which, of course, Malaysia is one, what I see, which is positive, is an attempt to invest in infrastructure over time. If instead we were to move to Africa, yes, or parts of South America, where cities are growing at nearly the same speed, there is no investment in public transport at all. I mean, certainly in Africa, they just don't literally have the money, and most of the development is informal. So I think one of the interesting issues for this country, where actually you have a pretty good planning system, a well-organized government, is how do you then manage this growth in terms of new towns, new environments, or make existing cities like KL more efficient, which takes me, I guess, to the big point, which is, you know, having been here for 3 days, and we've done a study which I just presented at the Asia Forum of different transport modes, yes, the way people use transport in different cities. I'll give you 2 statistics. They're not very good for KL.
Okay,
right?
Never mind.
And the statistics are the following. In Hong Kong, 93% use public transport to get to work. Right? In London and New York, their figures are around 50-55, right? Public transport. Right? In this city, it's 8%, and 79% use private cars. And that is because of the way the city has grown. You know, it's expanded quite a lot, and the fact that probably there hasn't been as much investment in sustainable transport. So I think the future of sustainable cities is to think of the shape, whether it's sprawling or whether it's dense, and the quality of provision of public transport in terms of trying to reduce the amount of dependence on the car. Those would be sort of the big issues.
Okay. Professor, if I may, you know, sometimes you look at problems in the city afterwards, after you've done everything else. So like transportation comes after everybody has been given a job and have a house to stay in, then now let's think of how do they commute. But maybe for the future, it's not for the lack of political will or not wanting to invest. That's very clear. In Kuala Lumpur, for example, the largest public expenditure recently to one single project was the MRT, mass rapid transit, which was 50 billion Malaysian dollars. So in Malaysian ringgit, in that sense, how would you advise us, if you can, moving forward, how do you integrate the philosophy of people commuting to work, whether it's sprawling or dense, from the very DNA of whatever it is that you want to do to KL? Yeah. Whatever policies, whatever new development, must consider that in the beginning, not after. Because otherwise, you'll be faced with legal wrangles, lack of space to build, and if you go to build underneath, then there's a lot more costs involved. So maybe there are other cities in the world who have integrated that from the very beginning, yeah, and has flourished. Professor, if we can go for the first break first, then we come back with your answer on that after this short break. 79% of people in KL, Kuala Lumpur, use public transport. Is our dream, but they don't. They use private cars. 8% only use public transport, and I can testify to this because when I go on the train and on the bus, I like it because it's not so packed. But I know that in the bigger picture, that's not good because my city is not sustainable, for example. But the question I pose to you is, if you can advise us on that, how do we make it central to any urban planning and development, for example? Because it sounds so easy to say it, but to do it other factors come into play, you know, commercial interests and whatever else. So how do you look at other cities maybe, and how they have managed to put that centrally?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that no city is perfect. And every city is always a work in progress. Cities are like they're like bodies. They're like living organisms. Right? So whenever you hear someone tell you, I'm the mayor of X, and we've got it right, you know, we've planned it perfectly, don't trust them.
Okay.
It's very, very unlikely that that is the case. And therefore, in answer to your question, I think there are two dimensions. One is that most of us live in cities that have been there for some time.
Yes.
So, and very few of us actually will be living in completely new design cities. More and more, but it's a tiny percentage compared to those who are going to be living in Mumbai, in Delhi, in Kuala Lumpur, in Lagos, etc., as they keep on growing. So you have two ways of intervening. One is retrofitting. In other words, you take what is there and make it better. Right? And I think that's where actually city leaders, and this is where governance comes in, I'll come back to that, really need to see what is possible in terms of just making a city like KL, for example, better than it is when it comes to issues of integration of transport, density, and all that. And I immediately would say that is possible. That's not. It requires political will. Yes. It requires the electorate to believe that's what they want, and investment of quite a lot of money.
Yes.
The second, and I think in many ways we can talk about that later, is planning new environments from scratch. And as I say, you could say it's easier to do that, but there's no magic bullet there, by the way. There's no one. I can't tell you, I know the perfect city. I don't. But I know a lot of elements that make cities better rather than worse. Okay. Now, let's go back to the retrofit. You asked me about, are there examples where one can look around the world and understand what is happening? I'm going to use two very, very different ones. London, the city I live in and have been involved in working with the mayor and doing research there, has actually, over the last 10 years, really reinvested in its both transport system but also the shape of the city. So, for example, in 2002, the mayor, the directly elected mayor, Ken Livingstone, decided to reduce the number of cars that went into the central area, just like in Singapore, with a congestion charge of $15 a day. So it's quite expensive. Right? Now, the result is that 20% less cars go into the center, and that's remained the same. Much more interestingly, I think, is that bus use has increased, doubled. And that means that, I guess to put it quite bluntly, the middle classes have started using buses. Now, that has required a big investment in new stock, secure cameras, punctuality, and then many people who would never have dreamt of using buses actually do that. Of course, we have a very good underground system that is being modernized. The City of London, which is the CBD of London, which is tiny, so a square mile, and has about 200,000, 300,000 people coming in on a daily basis. 95% of people who go there every day use public transport. Now, given that this is the CBD of one of the three major global centers in the world, that means that not only millionaires but billionaires use public transport. So this raises an issue of stigma, which is, in some countries, using public transport is seen as not appropriate for people like me and you, right? In other countries, this has to do, of course, with culture. If it's safe, if it's clean and it's efficient, why would you spend 3 hours in a car? So that's one example. Other end of the world, Colombia in South America, a much poorer city, 3-4 hour average commuting times on a daily basis. What happened there is that a mayor around the year 2000 introduced what is known as the BRT, the Bus Rapid Transit System, which is basically a dedicated lane which with a bus that nothing gets in its way, goes very fast, And basically, typically, you would get from your home to the place of work and back quicker on a bus than you would in a car. Now, you can choose, if you can afford to stay in your BMW and listen to wonderful music or whatever. That's fine. But the interesting thing about this relatively low-tech and therefore not very expensive system is that it has actually made Bogota now one of the more sustainable cities in South America. So here are two examples of retrofitting, which might be relevant to the discussion even for Kuala Lumpur.
We have economic development regions that we have executed in this country. And one of the bigger one, maybe the biggest, is Iskandar,
yes,
or the Iskandar Development Region. So there are new townships, yes, being built even as we speak. So what do you think should be the foremost important thing for them to consider? Because now maybe it's the development of office spaces and residential areas. But then later on, as we have experienced in KL, you would have to consider how you build the mobility of the people into the future. So what would your advice be?
Well, I'm only partially familiar with the Iskandar project, but I know the scheme, and the chief executive of Iskandar Investments was on my panel today. And I think this notion of actually taking a strip of land, large, very large, 3 times larger than Singapore, and turning it into, let's call it a metropolitan region, is obviously a good idea, rather than just allowing development wherever the market wants to take you. So I'm very much in favor of that. Okay. And I'm very much in favor of the fact that actually the government agency is investing in some of the infrastructure to make this happen. So as an approach, I think the Malaysian government is actually leading the way, being quite positive. The one thing to look out for carefully, and this is, I don't know the scheme well enough, is to avoid the temptation, which is very strong in planning methods around the world, of having a place where you work here, a place where you live here, okay, a place where you go to the cinema here, and a place where you maybe go to university there. Okay. So, you know, sometimes the terms which one hears, edu-city, yes, leisure parks, whatever, means that you get a city or a metropolitan zone which is made up of different zones. Now, I think that is what I would call slightly old-style planning. Okay. And I think the mixture, the bringing together the different uses, is actually what makes us enjoy cities. Yeah. I mean, if you think of it, that, you know, let's use Hong Kong or New York as two yes, models. The buzz on the street, the fact that you can meet friends and do business on the public space or on Fifth Avenue or in some of them, yes, the major intense sort of centers of Hong Kong. I think that is something to hang on to, because it's a win-win when it comes to the environment. The closer people are together, yeah, the denser the environment, the more you can support it with good public transport. The more sprawled it is, the more zoned it is, separation, yes, the less you can do that. So I think the two are very connected. It seems to me that Iskandar is moving in the right direction, but I think it could be denser and more inclusive, more mixed.
And that's also the added element of, it might be one of the rare few in the world where it's already taking into consideration the huge urban city-state of Singapore, because there'll be direct rail link to Johor Bahru. So the fluidity of motion of people is not just for the nation-state of Malaysia in this particular region called Iskandar, but also taking into consideration the needs and wants of the people from Singapore. I have to go for the last break, but once we are back, maybe I'm going to get your views on that too, because even if we just focus on just London or New York or Hong Kong or Kuala Lumpur, that's a complex enough challenge. But the moment you add in another society from a nation-state perspective, that creates another layer for us to consider. So what are your views on that after this short break? before we end, this is the 21st century where technology is pervasive, but also at a time when, in terms of the environment, we're very challenged. And the issue of climate change, the issue of as you have a rising population, how do you keep up with it? Supply of energy, clean water, for example. Some are even saying that the next war will be because of clean water, for example. So how do you look at it? Because if there's no denying that urbanization and cities are growing, then we're going to put a stress on the supply of resources that we need to keep the city growing.
Yeah. Well, for 5,000 years we've had the same problem. I mean, it's just, it's more noticeable because cities are growing faster. The stress on resources is enormous. And of course, we're much more aware of the effects on climate change that cities. But this is where I would turn the whole thing around and say that actually, cities are the centers of innovation.
Okay.
And today, cities contribute, even though, half the world, a little bit more, 55% now, of the world's population lives in cities. Together, they contribute 75% to CO2 emissions, global CO2 emissions. It's obvious why, because cities are the engines of the global economy.
Yes.
It's where there is industry, it's where there are vehicles, it's where buildings are concentrated. I mean, any building we're in, the electricity to turn the lights on, to power the air conditioning or have the heating, consumes 50% of world energy, buildings do. So it makes sense that cities are centers of consumption and centers of, therefore, pollution. Now, the positive side is that if you plan and manage cities well around new smart city, green city ideas, actually you can reduce the global CO2 emissions quite considerably.
Yeah.
Right? So cities are in many ways the test bed of positive ideas. Now, some are not good examples. We can think of hundreds,
yes,
unfortunately. Others are very positive examples. So I think in that sense, one shouldn't just see urbanization as a negative from this point of view. It's going to be, of course, a challenge of investment and of planning and of good governance to get these cities right. But once certain concepts are understood, I think actually cities could be the solution rather than the problem.
Thank you so much, Professor Ricky Badet, for sharing with us your thoughts on cities and urbanization. There are still a lot more to us, actually. I'm wondering if, why can't we have it both ways? Why can't we let those who want to stay out of the city centers be where they want in the rural areas, nice green fields and where the wind blows and the birds are chirping, but still be innovative and contributing, because the link can be there. But I guess that will have to be for another session. I hope you do come back to Kuala Lumpur. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Thanks to LSE Asia Forum 2014 for enabling this discussion to take place. And I'll see you again very, very soon. Send in your thoughts to all the platforms that we have, from Instagram, Facebook, right up until the mobile live streaming on our application on iOS and Android. I'll see you again. Goodbye. Thank you so much, Professor.
Good.